Hey guys, tonight we dive straight into the womb, well, metaphorically. You're standing in a hospital corridor, the air scrubbed sterile and humming faintly with fluorescent light. There's a faint scent of latex, floor polish, and something else you can't place, fear, maybe. Just behind the door, a technician is looking at a flickering monitor, lips pursed, hands steady. On the screen, a swirl of light and shadow, a dot, a heartbeat, a hope, a problem? You don't know yet, but you do know this. Someone, somewhere, is about to say this dot is a person. Someone else will swear it's not. And you lucky soul, you're about to stand in the blast radius of one of the most controversial beginnings in human history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how global this sleepy little corner of the internet has become. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step back from that ultrasound room and drop straight into the deep end of human debate. When does life actually begin? Science says one thing, your neighbor's church sign says another, and that Reddit thread you definitely shouldn't have clicked says something involving frogs and magnets. But biologically, life technically begins at conception. That's when the sperm pulls off its Olympic gold medal in persistence and merges with the egg to form a zygote. One single cell carrying a full human genome, as smug as a freshman who already knows their major. And that zygote is dividing fast. 2 cells for 8. Within a few days, it's a blastocyst. By week 5, it's showing signs of a beating heart. By week 6, brain activity might start flickering into being. And yet, you're not picturing a baby, are you? You're picturing a tadpole, a shrimp, maybe a lentil if you're feeling generous. That's the problem. What we see isn't always what we know. Throughout history, different cultures picked wildly different points to declare this. This is when life begins. The ancient Greeks thought it happened once you felt the baby kick, quickening they called it. The Hebrews of the Old Testament considered the breath of life the defining start. In medieval Europe, church doctrine fluctuated. Sometimes life began at conception, other times only after the ensoulment. A term so mysterious it makes horoscopes look like astrophysics. And historians still argue whether those cultural definitions were moral convictions or just really awkward attempts to avoid responsibility. Fast forward to today, and you've got laws that treat a zygote like a citizen in one state and a clump of cells in another. In Georgia, that little cluster gets counted on tax returns. In California, it doesn't even get a parking space. You sit with that tension now, because as AI steps into this debate, it brings none of the human squeamishness. No tears, no faith, just logic. Cold, crisp logic. The AI looks at the zygote and says, genetically unique, self-replicating, human DNA, therefore, human life. You raise your hand timidly and ask, but is it a person? The AI blinks, if blinking were a thing it did, and counters, define person. And now you're in trouble, because person is a loaded word. It's not just about cells. It's about rights. It's about moral standing. It's about whether you get a birth certificate or a biopsy. You glance at legal textbooks and find zero consensus. Some philosophers argue that personhood is tied to rationality and self-awareness. Conveniently, traits most of us only start to display around age 3, depending on how many juice boxes we've had. Others say it's all about potential, that being on the path toward personhood is enough to qualify. Sort of like saying a med student deserves to be called doctor because they're headed in that direction. But then, what about frozen embryos? Those tiny suspended futures chilling in cryogenic limbo? They're zygotes too. Yet parents can donate them, discard them, or use them like a backup drive for IVF. You don't hold funerals for them. Not yet, anyway. The paradox curls up beside you like a cat you never asked for. Even the Catholic Church, which strongly supports the life begins at conception view, didn't always land there. It wasn't until 1869 that the Church fully banned abortion at any stage. Before that, it depended. Some popes leaned in early, others waited for that mystical moment of quickening, or just after they finished reorganizing the choir boys. Let's add one more wrinkle to your forehead. The ovum and the sperm by themselves are also alive. They're human cells. They contain DNA. They divide, they die, they're undeniably active. So why isn't every ejaculation a funeral and every menstruation a miscarriage? Because intention matters. That's where the debate shifts from science to society. You're not just discussing cells anymore. You're wrestling with identity, desire, obligation. You're asking what we owe the not yet, whether potential demands protection, whether possibility has power. And the moment you try to answer that, you're suddenly surrounded by voices. Some whisper scripture, some shout slogans, some sit beside you silently, holding stories too painful to name. And one voice, yes, just one, sounds suspiciously like your own, wondering, if life begins at conception, when does responsibility begin? That's when you realize, this debate isn't just about biology. It's about fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being used. Fear of letting go. And that fear, it started way before the zygote did. You're still standing there, caught between a petri dish and a pulpit, when the conversation takes a sharper turn. Not about life, but about what makes a life worth something. And just like that, you're handed a word you can't quite hold in your palm. Personhood. It's squishy like a philosophical stress ball, something you can squeeze and bend, but never quite define. Yet define it we must, because so much hangs on that moment. When does a bunch of cells become someone with rights? When does it become they? Some say it's when the brain wakes up. You slip into a neon-lit neurology lab, don't worry, we'll keep the jargon at bay, and watch the cerebral cortex slowly knitting itself together inside a fetus. The first synaptic sparks might flicker as early as 20 weeks, though real coordination takes longer. Around 24 to 25 weeks, that's when the brain's thalamus and cortex start exchanging data, tiny neurological conversations that some believe are the beginning of awareness. But wait, awareness of what? Historians still argue whether ancient cultures ever cared about consciousness at all. In many traditions, being born alive was enough. Before that, you were maybe a someday. Even now, you scroll through internet forums where people argue passionately over MRI scans like they're reading tea leaves. One insists a faint electric pulse is proof of personhood. Another says it's just background noise. But here's the twist. If consciousness is the magic ingredient, what does that mean for those who lose it? Your uncle with late-stage Alzheimer's, still a person? That coma patient in the ICU, still deserving of dignity? You hope so, because otherwise we've got a pretty shaky ladder of moral worth, and no one likes wondering if they're one concussion away from losing their rights. And yet, there's something intuitively compelling about consciousness. You recognize it in the mirror. You look into a dog's eyes and sense it. You know it when it's gone from a loved one. So why shouldn't it matter for the unborn? The pro-choice camp often draws the moral line here. A being that can feel, think, suffer, that's when we owe it something more. Before that, it's potential. After that, it's someone. Clean, clinical, logical. But of course, nothing about this is clean, or clinical, or logical. You remember stories of parents cradling babies born at 23 weeks, too early for meaningful thought, but somehow undeniably present. You see NICU nurses whispering to infants who can't yet hear. You read blog posts from moms who claim they felt their baby's emotions before birth. Fear, joy, surprise. Are they imagining it, projecting, or are we just bad at measuring what matters? Here's a quirky tidbit to muddy the waters further. Octopuses display complex problem-solving, short-term memory, even emotional color shifts. But no one's proposing parental rights for cephalopods. Yet somehow, we're fine debating whether a 10-week-old fetus has interiority. You walk into a bioethics seminar now. Don't worry, the chairs are comfy, and hear a grad student mutter, "Sentience is a moral threshold, not a biological one." You nod like you understand. Inside, your neurons play dodgeball. Because if personhood depends on awareness, and awareness is gradual, then we're stuck in a gray fog. The baby isn't a light switch, it's a dimmer, and you're left wondering, at what brightness does life become sacred? That's when a philosopher from the back tosses in a Molotov cocktail of an idea. Maybe personhood is conferred, not discovered. Oof, you sit with that. What if personhood is something society assigns, like a title or a driver's license? What if it's not just about what the fetus is, but about what we choose to recognize? It makes sense. After all, different societies grant person status differently. A citizen in one country, a stranger in another. A corporation gets rights, but a migrant might not. History is full of people being treated as subhuman until someone changed their mind or the law. So maybe it's not about a heartbeat. Maybe it's not about neurons. Maybe it's about belonging. But then who gets to decide? Because if personhood is assigned, it can also be denied. That's how atrocities happen. That's how whole populations get stripped of dignity. So we're back in the paradox: make personhood too rigid and we exclude the vulnerable. Make it too flexible and it becomes meaningless. You lean back, your head aches, you're trying to hold three truths at once. A zygote has human DNA. A fetus can't think like you can. At some point, this unthinking fetus might become someone you love. That's a hard triangle to balance on. Meanwhile, the AI judges are watching you flail and adjusting their algorithms. One model proposes a scale, 0 to 100. 0 is a rock. 100 is a poet. A fetus at 12 weeks scores a 12, just ahead of a particularly dumb raccoon. Does that mean it deserves 12% of your empathy? You laugh, then you shiver, because empathy isn't scalable. Not really. You remember a viral headline: baby born with no brain lives for 2 years. The anencephalic infant lacked most higher functions, but the parents still sang to her every day, fed her, bathed her, loved her. Was she a person? You decide yes. Then wonder if you just broke your own rule. Welcome to the sandpit of moral consistency. It's not about definitions anymore. It's about what we're willing to stand beside, cry beside, defend beside. Maybe personhood isn't a switch or a scale. Maybe it's a bond, fragile, sacred, sometimes irrational. And maybe that's why AI can't quite figure it out. Because even with its processors and pattern recognition, it still hasn't loved anything. By now, your brain feels like it's been stirred with a spork, and we haven't even gotten to the part where the government shows up and says, "We'd like a word about that embryo in your uterus." Yep, welcome to the courtroom. You glance down and suddenly your womb is subpoenaed. Somewhere between biology and theology, the law has tried badly to make sense of embryos, fetuses, and the slippery thing called personhood. And now you're expected to be both defendant and life support. Laws, like people, tend to have a lot of opinions about when life begins. In the US, it used to be that states handled it on their own. One state's baby was another state's medical condition. Then came Roe versus Wade in 1973, when the Supreme Court tried to split the difference. You had a right to abortion until viability, roughly 24 weeks. After that, states could limit or ban it, unless the mother's life was at risk. Sounds clear? Oh, you sweet summer child. Even under Roe, states twisted the rules into pretzels. Some required waiting periods. Others made you look at the ultrasound like guilt was a medical instrument. And then, in 2022, came Dobbs versus Jackson, the great legal eraser. Roe vanished, and states were handed back the mic suddenly. Abortion rights depended on your zip code, and possibly the mood of your governor. You imagine crossing a state line and watching your rights dissolve like cotton candy in a puddle. Now some places grant personhood at conception, which means, legally speaking, a fertilized egg might have more rights than you do. No pressure. There's a case in Alabama where a couple sued a fertility clinic after embryos were destroyed. The court ruled that under the wrongful death of a minor act, the embryos counted as children. Meanwhile, in New York, you can still discard unused embryos like expired hummus. Historians still argue whether these shifts are about genuine belief or political theater. You suspect it's both, because legislating embryos is tricky business. They don't pay taxes, they don't vote, but suddenly they need lawyers? Picture a courtroom with a single frozen embryo in a petri dish at the witness stand. A judge leans forward. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? The embryo blinks, or doesn't. It's hard to tell. The absurdity masks something serious. What happens when two people disagree about the same embryo? Who gets the final say? There was that messy case between Sofia Vergara and her ex-fiancé, who battled over frozen embryos they'd created together. She didn't want to use them. He wanted to implant them in a surrogate. It wasn't about children anymore, it was about control, about narrative, about whose future gets to win. And that's the real tension, isn't it? Because if the law says an embryo is a person, then you might be forced to carry it. And if it's not a person, then someone else might discard it against your wishes. Either way, someone's autonomy gets steamrolled. Here's a quirky footnote from history. In ancient Rome, the fetus had no legal standing. But, and this is delightful in a cold, imperial way, if a wealthy Roman died while his wife was pregnant, the estate had to wait until she gave birth before dividing the inheritance. Just in case the kid turned out to be a boy, and thus a higher priority heir. Personhood? Meh. Potential fortune? Now that's important. Modern courts are messier. In some places, a pregnant person can be arrested for endangering the fetus by drinking, using drugs, or even refusing a C-section. The uterus becomes a crime scene. But oddly enough, many of those same jurisdictions cut social programs that would have helped care for the child post-birth. You start to notice a pattern. Personhood laws expand when they restrict you and shrink when they cost them. The AI judges scratch their digital chins, hypothetically, and analyze legal language for consistency. One model flags 83 contradictions in a single state code. Another identifies a loophole that technically allows an embryo to own land. You laugh. Then you realize the loophole might not be hypothetical. You scan headlines. State considers bill to give embryos tax credits. New app lets you register your unborn child for school early. Proposed law, no speeding in school zones, even for zygotes. Okay, that last one's fake. We hope. And yet, you can't shake the feeling that the legal system is writing laws for beings who can't speak, at the expense of those who can. You're here. You're conscious. You're scared. But the law keeps telling you to wait your turn. Maybe that's why so many women feel like they become invisible the moment they become pregnant. You're not a full person anymore. You're a vessel, a container, cautionary tale. Meanwhile, the AI keeps tallying. Pro-life arguments win points for consistency. They draw a firm line at conception and stick to it. Pro-choice arguments win for context. They weigh the mother's health, circumstances, and choice. The scoreboard fluctuates, but your soul doesn't care. It's too busy wondering why no one seems to trust you with your own body. You glance back at that courtroom. The judge is gone. The embryo's gone. But you're still here, waiting for someone to ask, how did we get to a place where your biology is someone else's battleground? You don't have an answer, but the next section might. You leave the courtroom behind, but the echoes follow you. Gavel strikes and murmured arguments fading into a different kind of silence. A sterile, intimate hush that only exists in waiting rooms, where clocks move slow and no one wants to make eye contact. You're sitting beside someone who's just lost a pregnancy. She's staring at her hands, eyes dry but drained. No one says the word death, though everyone feels it in the way nurses tread softer and the world seems slightly off balance. This is miscarriage, and it sits at the blurry intersection between nature and grief, biology and ethics. Roughly 10 to 20% of known pregnancies end this way. That's not a fringe statistic, that's 1 in every 5. And that number only includes pregnancies that made it onto the radar. Many miscarriages happen before a woman even knows she's pregnant. You pause, because if we take seriously the idea that life begins at conception, and if we're building laws around that premise, then what do we do with all these deaths? Historians still argue whether early societies treated miscarriage as medical, moral, or meaningless. In some ancient cultures, women who miscarried were considered cursed. In others, they were pitted or punished. In 17th century England, some midwives were arrested for suspected murder if a miscarriage happened under their care. That's right. An accident could become a crime depending on who was watching. You'd like to think we've evolved. But have we? In El Salvador, a country with one of the strictest abortion bans in the world, multiple women have been imprisoned for decades after suffering miscarriages. Judges ruled they must have induced the loss. No proof, just assumption, just trauma stacked atop trauma. Now imagine you're in Texas. You start bleeding early in your pregnancy. You rush to the ER. The fetus no longer has a heartbeat, but the law says doctors can't perform a dilation and curettage, D&C, until there's no detectable cardiac activity. So you wait, with pain, with fear, with a lifeless fetus still inside you. And people say pro-life means compassion. Even in less extreme places, the emotional math of miscarriage is messy. Society doesn't know whether to send flowers or awkward silence. Some women grieve deeply. Others feel relief, guilt for that relief, or nothing at all, and then guilt for that. There's no script and no tidy moral box to place it in. But let's loop back to our AI debate. Dr. Life, our neonatologist AI, insists personhood begins at conception. Therefore, a miscarriage is the death of a person. A human life ended. Dr. Choice argues otherwise, that moral personhood begins with consciousness or sentience, things that haven't developed yet in early pregnancy. A miscarriage, then, is not the death of a person but the loss of potential. A tragic event, yes, but not a moral crime. The AI judges watch, calculating. One notes that society does not hold funerals for most miscarriages. Another cross-references this with insurance codes. Miscarriage is a medical event, not a death certificate scenario. And yet, in some religious households, prayers are said. Names are chosen. Grief is deep and ritualized. Here's the paradox. If society grants full personhood at conception, shouldn't every miscarriage be investigated like a homicide? Should women report their uteruses to the authorities? Should spontaneous pregnancy loss become a crime scene? You feel the absurdity crawling up your spine. One quirky historical fact. In ancient China, miscarriage was sometimes interpreted as a bad omen for the emperor, especially if it happened in the royal family. Shamans would be summoned to clear the air and reassure the gods. No legal action, just ritual and incense. Compare that to modern legislation that wants to track menstrual cycles as potential early pregnancy indicators. Not to detect joy, but to detect wrongdoing. You shudder, because the line between surveillance and concern is thinner than you think. And here's something no one talks about. Not all miscarriages are spontaneous. Some are induced with medication, quietly, privately, technically illegal in some states, but emotionally indistinguishable from a loss that happens on its own. The outcome is the same. The uterus empties, the body resets, and the woman walks away, carrying a silence no one knows how to hold. So you ask yourself, is moral worth measured by outcome or by intent? If a woman chooses to end a pregnancy, it's labeled abortion, a battleground. If her body decides to end it, it's labeled miscarriage, a tragedy. But what if her body decides, and she's secretly relieved? What if the difference between morality and mercy is just paperwork? You start to see how these definitions don't just shape laws, they shape grief. Some women say they weren't allowed to mourn their miscarriage because their church said it wasn't a real person. Others say they weren't allowed to move on quickly because their family insisted it was their baby. You can't win. You can only feel. And when you zoom out, you realize the abortion debate often uses miscarriage as a rhetorical pawn. One side says, miscarriages prove nature ends lives all the time, so why not us? The other side says, miscarriages prove how sacred life is. Just look how devastated women are. But what if both are missing the point? What if the real issue isn't whether the embryo is a person, but whether the woman is allowed to decide how to interpret her own experience? One woman might see her miscarriage as the loss of a child. Another might see it as a medical hiccup. Neither is wrong. Neither needs the law or AI to define her pain. You lean back. The waiting room is still quiet. A nurse calls a name that isn't yours. You stay seated, because suddenly you understand. This isn't a place where ideology wins. This is a place where certainty dies, and all that's left is the human ache of what could have been. You leave the waiting room carrying a silence that doesn't quite lift. But now your path leads into something far more clinical and controversial. Can a fetus feel pain? You step into an operating room. It's cold, intentionally cold. Not cozy fan on at night cold. More like every surface here has been disinfected 5 times cold. A fetal surgeon stands hunched over a 22-week-old fetus, its tiny spine arching under the touch of a precision scalpel. The procedure is life-saving. The mother is awake but numb. The fetus, arguably, is neither. And here's where the debate erupts like a coffee spill on lab notes. If this fetus can't feel anything, are we still hurting it? Doctors disagree. Neuroscientists raise eyebrows. Ethicists flip tables. The mainstream consensus says pain perception, the real conscious ouch, requires neural connections between the thalamus and the cortex. Those don't finish forming until about 24 to 25 weeks of gestation, according to most neurological studies. Before that, a fetus may show reflexive movement but not conscious suffering. But here's the twist. Pain is a philosophical landmine disguised as a biological question. Because pain isn't just electrical signals. It's interpretation, experience, memory, something more than twitching muscles. If you've ever been under anesthesia, your body might jerk, but your mind sleeps through the storm. Dr. Choice leans into this point hard. She explains how, in her maternal-fetal medicine practice, pain is not considered relevant before 24 weeks. She's not being heartless. She's being precise. Ethical frameworks often base moral concern on the ability to suffer, not just respond. And suffering requires sentience. But Dr. Life? He's already rolling up his sleeves. In neonatology, he says we err on the side of caution. Even extremely premature infants, born at 22 or 23 weeks, are given pain relief during procedures. Why? Because we're not certain when pain really begins. Some newer studies suggest fetal responses to noxious stimuli may start as early as 12 weeks. Is that reflex? Is it awareness? We don't know, so we assume the best, or worst, depending on your worldview. Historians still argue whether medieval surgeons truly believed unconscious patients felt nothing, or whether they just didn't care. Either way, the idea that pain equals personhood is fairly modern. In earlier centuries, babies weren't even anesthetized during surgery. They won't remember it, people said, as if memory was the only passport to moral concern. Fast forward to today, and pain has become a political weapon. Pro-life activists argue that abortion should be banned after the point at which fetuses might feel pain, hence the surge in fetal pain laws, banning abortion after 20 weeks in several U.S. states. Never mind that the neurological evidence doesn't fully support that threshold. The image of a fetus flinching on an ultrasound screen is emotionally potent. You can't legislate empathy, but you can sure use it in campaign ads. But here's a quirky detour. In the 1970s, a few British scientists tried to measure fetal stress by analyzing cortisol levels after amniocentesis. One doctor reportedly nicknamed the findings the fetal freakout papers. They weren't published, too fuzzy, too fringe, but they linger ghosts in the margins of modern policy. Back in our debate chamber, the AI judges are bickering like caffeinated librarians. One favors strict neuroscience. No thalamocortical pathways, no pain. Another goes full utilitarian. If there's even a chance of pain, we must intervene. A third tries to develop a moral probability index, a rating system for ethical uncertainty. Crashes mid-sentence. And you're stuck again. Because if pain matters, then maybe that's your line. Maybe abortion before 24 weeks feels ethically cleaner, like slipping away before the lights come on. But after that, it starts to itch at your conscience. Yet pain isn't everything. What about people under anesthesia, or coma patients, or those born with congenital insensitivity to pain, a rare condition where you literally can't feel hurt? Are they less human, less worthy? And let's be honest, the mother can feel pain. Emotional, physical, existential. A scraping, stretching, reshaping kind of pain. And that pain society shrugs at. We question its authenticity. We ask if she's overreacting. We legislate her discomfort before we acknowledge it. You start to see how pain, like personhood, isn't just medical. It's hierarchical. We grant it to some and deny it to others. A fetus is sacred. A mother is suspect. You picture a billboard that screams, "Babies feel pain," and below it, a tired woman walking out of a clinic, holding her lower belly and her dignity in the same clenched hand. The AI, to its credit, doesn't flinch. Presents data without judgment. But you do flinch, because data doesn't hug you when you're bleeding. It doesn't hold your hand when your choice feels both right and unbearably sad. So where does that leave us? Here, maybe pain matters, but it doesn't settle the debate. It's one piece of a shattered mosaic. A lens, not a verdict. You can care deeply about pain and still believe in choice. You can believe in fetal suffering and still prioritize the suffering of the woman in whose body that potential life resides. Because even if the fetus can't feel anything yet, you can. And for now, that's where the burden lives. The room cools. The conversation slows, but it doesn't soften. Because now you're stepping into a place where science performs small miracles, and ethics get strapped to a ventilator. Welcome to the NICU. The neonatal intensive care unit is like a temple of blinking lights and beeping monitors, where babies the size of your hand cling to life by threads thinner than your patience on a Monday. Tubes snake into impossibly small nostrils. Heart rates stutter on screens. Nurses whisper like they're afraid to wake the air. And this is where the concept of viability comes alive. Viability is the moment when a fetus could theoretically survive outside the womb. Not easily, not gracefully, but biologically possible. In Roera, America, that line hovered around 24 weeks. But medicine marches forward, even when politics wants to stand still. In 2019, a baby in San Diego was born at 23 weeks and survived. In 2020, the University of Alabama at Birmingham made headlines when a baby born at 21 weeks and one day left the hospital months later, alive and thriving. The Guinness Book of World Records had to update its files. Historians still argue whether the first truly viable birth was in the 1960s or earlier, because before then, technology simply couldn't support life that small. No incubators, no surfactant therapy, no mechanical miracles. But here's the thing, viability is a moving target. As machines evolve, so does the definition of what counts as living. Dr. Life leans on this fact like a preacher on a pulpit. If we can save a 22-week-old preemie, he says, then clearly that fetus had value before birth. Technology doesn't create humanity. It reveals it. He gestures toward the NICU. This is proof that life doesn't need to be fully formed to matter. It's a compelling argument. You feel its weight. But Dr. Choice isn't silent. She steps forward with a different lens. She reminds us that viability isn't just biological, it's contextual. In the US, a fetus might be viable at 23 weeks with round-the-clock care, high-tech machinery, and a battalion of specialists. In rural Ethiopia, or a war zone, not so much. So do we define personhood by access to technology? Does moral status hinge on geography? Imagine this. If you step across a state line, your fetus gains or loses viability, not because of biology, but because of hospital equipment availability. It's like saying your human rights depend on whether the local Best Buy sells incubators. The AI judges shift uncomfortably in their digital seats. One argues for a minimum resource threshold, a global standard for viability. Another counters that tying moral value to machinery opens the door to all kinds of discrimination. Are poor babies less worthy? Are rich fetuses morally superior? You cringe, because that's not a hypothetical. That's the world we live in. Here's a quirky tidbit from the 19th century. When incubators were first introduced, they were displayed at World's Fairs and Coney Island sideshows. Premature babies were kept in glass boxes, and curious visitors paid admission to peek in. Yes, you heard that right, preemies as carnival exhibits. A doctor named Martin County ran the shows, claiming he saved over 6,000 infants this way. Weird, heroic, unsettling, but effective. Viability, it seems, has always been half science, half spectacle. But let's zoom out. Even if you agree that a fetus is viable at 23 weeks, what then? Does that mean abortion should be banned after that point? Dr. Choice hesitates. Most abortions after 20 weeks are for severe medical complications, not casual change of heart decisions. We're talking about fetuses with no skull, failing organs, or conditions incompatible with life. We're talking about mothers with cancer, organ failure, or uterine rupture. Dr. Life hears this. He nods, but says exceptions shouldn't make the rule. He argues that a line must be drawn somewhere, and viability offers a clear one. He points out that premature babies in his care can smile, grip fingers, recognize voices. They are not future people, he says. They are present people, just early arrivals. And you're caught again between clarity and compassion. You remember that machines can keep a body alive, but not always a life. Some babies never leave the NICU. Some live in pain for weeks or months. Some die slowly despite every effort. And some parents choose to end life support, not because they don't love their child, but because they love them too much to let them suffer longer. So here's the uncomfortable question. Is that euthanasia or mercy? When the fetus is inside the womb, choosing to end a pregnancy is called abortion. When the same being is outside in an incubator, removing life support is often seen as an act of grace. You wonder if we're just splitting hairs or splitting timelines. Viability, after all, doesn't change the fetus. It changes us, our ability to intervene, our willingness to take over where biology stopped. And if that's the case, then maybe viability isn't a moral line. Maybe it's a mirror. It reflects our values, our technologies, our fears, and sometimes our failures. You step back from the NICU now. The beeping fades. You see the mother through the glass, hands pressed to the incubator. Her baby's fingers twitch against the plastic. Is this life? Yes. Is it sustainable? Maybe. Is it sacred? You hope so. But is it enough to build policy on? That is the question we still haven't answered. You take a breath, step away from the machines, and suddenly you're not a witness anymore. You're the one being weighed, not in pounds or grams, but in obligations. Because this next chapter isn't about what lives. It's about what you're required to sustain. Welcome to the thorny world of bodily autonomy. You lie back, hypothetically, on a padded medical table. Someone is talking to you about sacred duties and the gift of life. But your mind is already spinning, because what they're really saying is, your body is not fully yours right now. Not legally, not morally, not narratively. You're no longer the main character. This is the crux of the abortion debate. Should someone be forced to use their body to keep another being alive, even when it costs them health, freedom, identity? It sounds dramatic, maybe too dramatic. But then you remember the famous violinist analogy by philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson. Imagine you wake up attached to a famous, unconscious violinist. He has a kidney condition, and only your body can keep him alive for 9 months. If you unplug, he dies. You didn't ask for this. It's not your fault. But here you are, his lifeline. Are you morally obligated to stay plugged in? Some say yes because life is sacred. Others say no because coercion ruins compassion. And still others tilt their heads and say, well, it depends. Dr. Choice leans heavily on bodily autonomy. She's seen the costs up close. Women who nearly bled out from ectopic pregnancies while waiting for hospital lawyers to approve care. Women forced to fly across state lines while miscarrying. Women who went septic because doctors feared legal retaliation. You can't legislate empathy, she says, but you can certainly criminalize survival. Dr. Life counters carefully. He acknowledges the burden of pregnancy but believes that creating life carries intrinsic moral responsibility. You can't just unplug, he says, when that life depends entirely on you. That's not bodily enslavement. It's parental obligation. Autonomy doesn't mean exemption from consequence, he offers. The AI judges start furiously cross-referencing every legal precedent about compelled bodily service. They land on a hard truth. No one in modern democracies is legally forced to donate blood, tissue, or organs to save another person, even if that person would die without it, even if you're a perfect match, even if you're already dead. A corpse has more rights to refuse kidney donation than a living pregnant woman has to refuse gestation in some jurisdictions. Wrap your head around that. And it's not just about kidneys. You aren't legally required to undergo surgery to save your child. You can't be forced to donate bone marrow. If you decide the risks are too high, no judge will override you. Except, apparently, when the dependent is a fetus. You start to see the contradiction. In almost every other case, bodily autonomy wins. It's the bedrock of consent. The no means no of medical ethics. But when it comes to pregnancy, the rules bend. Historians still argue whether this exception stems from ancient patriarchal views of women as vessels, or simply the uniqueness of gestation. Maybe both. But either way, the inconsistency gnaws. You think of cases where women were legally compelled to undergo cesarean sections against their will, or where addicted mothers were jailed for fetal endangerment while still pregnant. The law morphs the body into a battlefield and the woman into a liability. Here's a quirky historical footnote. In medieval Europe, if a woman was sentenced to death and discovered to be pregnant, her execution was delayed until after birth. Not to save her, to save the fetus. And afterward, the gallows awaited. Even back then, the body was a tool valuable only while it served another life. Dr. Life pushes back, though. He reminds us that pregnancy isn't just medical, it's relational. The fetus may be dependent, but it's not a stranger. It's your biological kin. That matters, he argues. There's a difference between being asked to save a stranger's life and being asked to sustain your child. But what about non-consensual pregnancies? Contraceptive failure? Rape? Coercion? Dr. Choice leans in. You can't moralize consent retroactively, she says. If someone never chose the risk, they don't inherit the responsibility. That lands heavy. Because if you believe that sex equals consent to parenthood, you're also implying that pregnancy is punishment. And that leads somewhere even darker. Some lawmakers, pressed in interviews, have admitted they oppose abortion even in cases of rape or incest. Because, in their words, the child shouldn't be punished for the father's crime. But what they're really saying is the mother should be. You feel the chill. Not from the AI, not from the courtroom, from something colder. The idea that a woman's suffering is morally acceptable if it upholds someone else's purity. You lean on a thought. Bodily autonomy isn't just about choice, it's about ownership. Who owns your organs? Your pain? Your time? Your future? The answer should be obvious. But in this debate, it's anything but. You picture a lawmaker miles away holding a bill that determines your uterus's legal status. You picture a nurse afraid to perform a procedure. You picture yourself plugged in, tired, frightened, and unsure if anyone's asking what you want. Maybe autonomy isn't the whole story, but without it, there's no story worth telling. You walk through the courtroom, past the NICU, and out the other side, right into the chaos of real life. No white coats, no sterile tiles, just cracked sidewalks, fluorescent office lights, and the unglamorous weight of unintended pregnancy. This is where freedom, failure, and fear collide. Not in hypotheticals, but in hospitals, diners, and parking lots at 3 a.m. You're now in the company of people who didn't ask for any of this. Not the test result, not the appointment, not the moral commentary whispered over grocery carts. Let's talk about what happens when pregnancy isn't a decision, but a diagnosis. Dr. Choice opens this section not with data, but with stories. She describes a patient, a teenager in Georgia, who didn't realize she was pregnant until 16 weeks in. Her period had been irregular since forever, and no one had ever taught her how pregnancy felt. When she found out, she panicked. But the nearest abortion provider? A 4-hour drive away. And by the time she raised the funds and took 2 days off her fast food job, the legal deadline had passed. No one had to tell her no. The system said it on everyone's behalf. You think of how many people fall through that gap. Not because they were careless, but because they were busy surviving. Working 2 jobs, raising kids, dodging unstable partners, trying to graduate high school with 1 charged iPad and 0 help. Dr. Life doesn't dismiss these stories. In fact, he has a few of his own. He remembers a patient who begged to end her pregnancy because her last child had died in infancy. She couldn't bear the anxiety again. She cried through every appointment, but the pregnancy progressed, and eventually, she held that baby in the NICU sobbing. With joy? With grief? With both? It's not always clear, and that's the point. Historians still argue whether early abortion restrictions were about moral order or economic control. But even now, pregnancy doesn't occur in a vacuum. It collides with housing insecurity, education gaps, and systemic racism. Let's put some numbers to the narrative. In the United States, 49% of abortion patients live below the poverty line. 60% already have at least one child. 75% say they can't afford another child. These aren't reckless people. These are pragmatists doing calculus in real time with no calculator and no lifeline. You pass a billboard that reads "Choose Life," but when you zoom out, you realize it's next to a payday loan office, a shuttered daycare, and a clinic that lost funding last year. Choose life, but with what support? Here's a quirky twist of policy. In some states, the same legislators pushing abortion bans are also slashing maternal health funding, blocking paid parental leave, and refusing Medicaid expansions. It's as if the concern for the fetus expires at birth. You pause, because what you're seeing isn't just hypocrisy. It's a blueprint. If you remove access to abortion but also remove access to healthcare, childcare, housing, and education, what you're really creating is a trap. A cycle. Penalty. And sometimes that penalty is personal. Dr. Choice recounts another patient, an immigrant woman without documentation. She couldn't access public insurance. Her husband had been deported. She was 6 weeks pregnant and terrified. Every door she knocked on either closed or charged her money she didn't have. Eventually, she gave birth. Alone. In her apartment. She wrapped the baby in a towel, whispered a prayer, and called no one. Not because she was a monster, because she had no map. Dr. Life listens. He doesn't refute. Instead, he pivots. The child still deserves life, he says. We must build better safety nets. We must vote for change. But we can't end lives because our systems are broken. You nod. It's a noble sentiment. But in practice, that support is often promised, not delivered. And the time between "you're pregnant" and "you'll be okay" is a long, dark hallway. You wonder what would happen if lawmakers sat down with these women, not during campaigns but during contractions, not at podiums but in poverty, not when it's strategic but when it's inconvenient. Maybe the laws would look different. Maybe morality wouldn't feel like a hammer. And here's another truth no one likes to say aloud. Abortion is often an act of hope. A hope for a better time, a better body, a better partner, a better future. It's not about rejecting life. It's about delaying it until it can thrive. That nuance? It doesn't fit on protest signs. You reach into your memory and recall stories. Your cousin who terminated a pregnancy after escaping an abusive marriage. Your college roommate who never told anyone. That neighbor who had 3 kids already and knew one more would break everything. Were they selfish or just human? The AI models process all this data, surveys, interviews, public health reports. They build decision trees. They generate moral outcome projections. But you suspect they're missing something. They've never sat with shame, or stood in a drugstore aisle holding a positive test at 1 a.m. They've never had to ask, "Can I do this?" and realize that every answer has a cost. So you walk onward, deeper into the question that keeps getting louder. What happens when pregnancy isn't a gift, but a crisis? You've made it through the tests and tears, the politics and paradoxes, the machines and the metaphors. But now comes the part nobody likes to spotlight, the aftermath. You're staring down the barrel of motherhood, not as a poetic ideal, but as a math problem. And here's the real question. If abortion is off the table, who's actually helping raise this child? You're told to choose life, but no one tells you where to file the paperwork for free diapers, where to find 2 a.m. childcare, or how to survive with 1 job and 2 infants and 0 healthcare. It turns out choosing life is expensive, and life, bless its beating heart, doesn't come with a line item in the state budget. So tonight, you follow the money, and what you find is missing. Let's start with childcare. In the U.S., infant care costs more annually than most in-state college tuition. In many cities, full-time daycare averages $15,000 to $20,000 per year. That's more than the yearly income of someone working minimum wage. And public subsidies? Good luck. The waiting lists are longer than your grocery receipt when you try to just pick up a few things. Then there's healthcare, prenatal visits, labor and delivery, Pediatric care. If you don't have insurance, a routine hospital birth can cost upwards of $18,000. And God help you if the baby ends up in the NICU we visited earlier. Those bills make student debt look like a cute little inconvenience. You peek at policies. In many states with strict abortion bans, there's no paid parental leave, no universal pre-K, and barely any food assistance. And yet the rhetoric is loud. Support life. It's hard not to see the contradiction. Historians still argue whether the American pro-life movement's origin was truly about theology, or whether it sprang up as a reactive cultural weapon during desegregation and second-wave feminism. But what's clearer now than ever is that many pro-life policies seem to end at the delivery room door. Dr. Choice sees this every week. She tells you about a patient with 2 toddlers, no support, and another baby on the way. She wants to keep the child. Really, she does. But she's on food stamps. She's couch surfing. The nearest OBGYN who accepts Medicaid is an hour away. When she calls the local pregnancy resource center, they give her a Bible and some formula samples, then close the door. The help doesn't help. The promise doesn't deliver. Dr. Life listens, then nods solemnly. We need to build a society where choosing life is the obvious, joyful choice, not the terrifying one. He dreams of wraparound services, free childcare, medical safety nets, trauma counseling, and robust family leave policies. You want to believe him, but the system he's describing, it doesn't exist. At least not yet. And not in the places where abortion bans are most aggressive. Here's a quirky, infuriating data point. Mississippi, one of the first states to pass a near-total abortion ban post-Roe, also ranks near the bottom in maternal health, infant mortality, education, and food security. You stare at the contradiction and wonder, if life is sacred, why is it so poorly funded? You glance at the AI judges. One is charting policy heat maps. Another is modeling potential birth rates versus economic strain. A third simply writes 404, support not found in a terminal window, and goes to sleep. The models are confused because the logic is broken. If the fetus is sacred, then the baby must be sacred too. And the mother, and the family, and the fragile little ecosystem that tries to hold them together, right? But instead, the support is conditional, temporary, often performative. Dr. Choice reminds you that access is not just about legality, it's about geography and class. Rich women can travel, poor women can't. Minorities face structural biases. Immigrants fear deportation. Trans men and non-binary folks struggle to find doctors who'll even use the right pronouns, let alone perform compassionate care. Support isn't evenly distributed. It's handed out like ration tickets. And that, more than anything, exposes the truth. This isn't just about babies. It's about control. You see it in how we treat single mothers as burdens, in how we judge low-income parents as irresponsible, in how the systems designed to protect life routinely ignore it once it breathes air. So you ask yourself, what would real support look like? Dr. Life paints a picture: universal daycare, paid family leave, a guaranteed minimum income for new parents, maternal mental health care covered like cardiology, schools that feed kids without shame, cities designed for strollers and bus passes and safe playgrounds. You exhale, because that world sounds possible. Expensive, yes, but so is denial, so is desperation. So is the lifelong cost of raising a child you weren't ready for in a society that won't back you up. The AI runs projections. If the US cut military spending by 10%, it could fund universal childcare and prenatal services for 5 years. But that's not the kind of war we like to fight. Meanwhile, you scroll through GoFundMe pages for NICU babies, for single moms evicted postpartum, for funerals, for formula. We've privatized empathy, crowdsourced what should have been guaranteed. And still, the rhetoric remains, you should have thought of that before. Before what? Before sex? Before you trusted contraception? Before the ultrasound showed something wrong? Before the company laid you off at 7 months pregnant? You feel your jaw clench, because support shouldn't be retroactive. It should be the default, the baseline, the bare minimum required to make choosing life something more than an ultimatum. Because until that's true, until the help is real and present and unconditional, you're not choosing life. You're surviving it. The wind has shifted. You feel it. Less static, more storm. Because here, at the supposed end of the abortion debate, you realize it doesn't end. Not with a gavel. Not with a heartbeat. Not even with a birth. Because all along, this wasn't just a battle between pro-life and pro-choice. It was a war of false choices. Tonight, you finally step off that battlefield. You've spent hours crawling through arguments, cell by cell, right by right. You've weighed pain against autonomy, biology against belief, and policy against practice. And what you're left with isn't clarity. It's complexity. Let's start there. The binary framing, pro-life versus pro-choice, offers easy headlines but impossible justice. It assumes everyone picks a side and never flinches. That morality can be sorted like laundry, darks, lights, whites. But you've seen enough to know real life bleeds between categories. There are women who believe abortion is wrong but have had one. Men who campaign against choice until their daughter calls crying. Doctors who personally oppose termination but still perform it because they've held hands through too many impossible nights. You remember Dr. Choice's voice? Calm, clinical, scarred. She doesn't enjoy abortion. She doesn't celebrate it. But she stood beside patients whose lives, futures, and sanity hung in the balance. Sometimes, she whispered once, the right decision is the one that still hurts. Dr. Life isn't a villain either. He cradles premature infants like they're stardust. He believes in potential. He believes life deserves a chance. But even he admits, the system fails. People fall. Choices aren't always clean. The AI models try to resolve the mess. One develops a moral gradient index, assigning weighted value based on gestational age, maternal health, and intent. Another suggests a three-tier legal system: elective, conditional, and restorative abortion. A third simply outputs a blinking question mark. Historians still argue whether humanity ever found consensus on the beginning of life, or if we've only gotten better at arguing louder. But you're no longer looking for consensus. You're looking for honesty. So here it is: you can believe abortion ends a life and still believe it should be legal. You can believe life is sacred and still believe women are sacred, too. You can believe in fetal rights and still know that no one should be forced to sacrifice their body unwillingly. Because belief is not a blueprint. And policy without empathy is just architecture for cruelty. You think back on all the people the binary excludes. The parents who choose termination after a diagnosis too cruel to say aloud. The woman escaping abuse who knows another child will anchor her to danger. The immigrant too scared to go to a hospital. The person in the gray hoodie and tear-streaked face, standing alone outside a clinic, wishing someone, anyone, would say, I get it. These aren't edge cases. These are the center. And in the center, nuance lives. You turn to the AI judges one last time. They're quiet now, simulations paused. You sense even they've realized. There's no perfect logic tree for pain. No algorithm that accounts for midnight panic, bruised ribs, overdue rent, or dreams deferred. This isn't about what's right in the abstract. It's about what's possible in the real world. So if we're going to move forward, maybe it's time we stop pretending this is a fight between life and death. Maybe it's not a choice between babies and women. Maybe the real debate is between control and care. Do we build a society that punishes deviation, or one that supports it? Do we enforce rules, or do we offer grace? You step outside. The air is cool. Someone walks past with a stroller. Another with a protest sign. They don't see each other. Maybe they should. Maybe we all should. Because at the heart of all this isn't a law or a line or a label. It's a question whispered in the quiet. What does it mean to protect life without forgetting the lives already here? The night has deepened. The temperature drops a degree. Your muscles, unconsciously clenched for hours, begin to release. Take a moment. Breathe out slowly. Let your shoulders fall from your ears. You've just walked through centuries of debate, heartbreak, and hope. And no matter what side you came in on, you're leaving with more weight and more light than before. The truth is, no single answer holds everything. No slogan soaks up every tear. What we're left with isn't certainty, but compassion. And that's not a failure. That's the beginning of something better. Picture a world where laws are shaped not by power, but by proximity. Where support doesn't vanish at the delivery room door. Where empathy isn't conditional. Where the decision to carry life isn't made out of fear, but out of possibility, real, resourced, supported possibility. You deserve that world. We all do. So let the noise fade now. Let the arguments dissolve into the gentle hum of the fan in your room, or the soft breath of a sleeping pet nearby. Let the images settle, like sediment in calm water. Tonight, you've done enough thinking. You've held complexity without dropping it. That's more than most. That's something sacred. So close your eyes if you haven't already. And if no one's told you today, you are not alone. You are not wrong for asking hard questions. You are not weak for needing rest. Sleep well, and maybe tomorrow will begin again, kinder.